Hi everyone. So welcome back. So today I want to talk about Gulf War illness. So this is one that I have a lot of experience with again because I wrote my thesis on this. So this one I'm really excited about. So unlike the first two, Gulf War illness is much more restricted in scope just because it is restricted to a particular space and time. And the event we're talking about is going to be the first Gulf War. So before we delve into the disease, I think that it's important for me to give a little bit background context about what this war actually was and why we suspect something like this could have occurred. So, um, in the 90s, right, as the Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse, there is a power vacuum that opens in the world, and one of the people who try to take advantage of this power vacuum is Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. And in order to increase his access to the Persian Gulf, he decides to invade the tiny nation of Kuwait. Now, Kuwait doesn't really have a military. They can't really resist the powerful Iraqi military. So they easily lose the war, and Iraq takes over the nation. However, this doesn't really go well with the international community, and under the authorization of the UN, the US military organizes a broad coalition of nations and commences Operation Desert Shield, which then turned into Operation Desert Storm when the US actually attacks Iraqi forces, and the Iraqi forces are quickly overwhelmed by the American troops because there's the coalition, which is mostly composed of Americans, along with some, notably along with British, French, and Polish troops, but along many other nations. Um, those troops are stationed in Saudi Arabia, and they're quickly overpowering the Iraqis with their superior training and superior weapons. So this is the war, and the thing is, this was a smooth operation compared to later wars, and there was only 292 soldiers that lost their life, even though the expectation was thousands because of several reasons. Well, some of them being just the Iraqis were expected to be better trained, but there was also an expectation that the Iraqis would use chemical weapons and biological weapons because there was a fear that Saddam Hussein was actually developing these weapons, and there was actually some evidence that he had used these weapons earlier on against groups in his own country. So, in expectation of such chemical warfare, soldiers were supplied with um, a lot of untested chemicals and medications to protect them against these weapons. Furthermore, there was use of pesticides, and even more importantly, there was use of, well, there was a lot of burning oil wells that were bombed by the U.S. military, and so as a result of this, there was a lot of pollutants in the environment, and I am mentioning all of these pollutants specifically because the cause of the condition is not really known. We don't really know if there's a pathogen or a, um, a a pollutant from the environment or a stress mechanism. We don't really know what causes. We also don't know the mechanism by which this disease commences. There are several theories like neuroinflammation, gut bacteria imbalance, oxidative stress, and epigenetic impacts, but there's many more. Now, my lab and my thesis specifically focused on inflammation, which I covered in earlier videos, but very briefly, it's when um, inflammation, the cytokines are released in the nervous system, in neurons, even though there's not a pathogen that the inflammation is responding to. So it's occurring without a specific disease in place, and that neuroinflammation is causing the symptoms. And this brings us to what the symptoms actually are. So the symptoms are fatigue, pain, problems with the GI tract, sleep problems, skin issues, neurological problems, respiratory problems, and migraines. So there's a whole host of issues, and obviously not every veteran is going to display the same set of symptoms. And even the range of veterans who are experiencing this varies, but a good approximation is 30% of veterans in the first Gulf War. So it's a very big chunk. And over the years, more cases have been reported. So the VA and the DoD have paid more attention to people who have Gulf War illness. But um, Gulf War illness is still very useful in demonstrating the inequities faced by veterans in our society. So this is not just restricted to obviously Gulf War illness. Again, this reflects broader problems in the veteran healthcare system. But the VA hospitals have been plagued with a lot of problems over the years. First, claims made by veterans are sometimes denied because they don't have the proper documentation to link their health problems with their time in service, or they are disqualified due to a issue such as dishonorable discharge, even though they have served in the war. So there are some issues about that. For example, if they have drug use in service, that disqualifies them, and this is obviously leaving a very vulnerable population out of care. And I actually have a small anecdote about this. So I was volunteering with an EMS group in high school, or in my hometown in Long Island, and we were told to avoid taking patients to the VA hospitals as often as we can, just because there is not only problems with financing the care, but there's also very subpar service in some hospitals. Now, some hospitals, as I will address later, are amazing. They're actually performing better than some civilian hospitals. But on the other side of the coin, there's a lot of hospitals that are dilapidated, underfunded, and there's been reports of rusty surgical tools, bloody rags mixing with clean rags, and VA hospitals not being able to treat mental illnesses. So again, the variation is very high, but some VA hospitals function amazingly, and some others are really not able to respond to the needs of veterans. And again, some of the hospitals are more geared towards burn and amputation rather than mental health care. There was actually a scandal in 2014 where many veterans were found to have waited more than 90 days to get an appointment. Now, compounded with bad reputation, horror stories from the past, there is a very negative perception in the veteran community against the VA. So a lot of veterans don't see the VA as reliable, even for Gulf War illness. And the conditions of the VA do reflect, I think, a societal dismissal of veterans. Of course, we have parades. Of course, we say support our troops. But there's really not a whole lot of social programs and social safety nets in place to help the most vulnerable veterans. Of course, some of these veterans go through very traumatic experiences, and it's a common trope at this point to have homeless veterans in movies. It's a common trope to talk about the veterans who could not readjust back to society. And it's very tragic that this is the case because there are thousands of veterans who really are suffering through these problems. And while the military is an excellent jumping point for millions of soldiers throughout the years, it is also a place where many people not just get killed and wounded in action, but also suffer consequences once they get back home. And this is in part due to the stinginess of the U.S. government when it comes to funding veterans affairs. And this is very much a problem that soldiers in the Veterans Affairs system have faced. And this is not obviously the only reason that veterans have struggled with these problems, but veterans have struggled with addiction, problems with reintegrating back to civilian life, and suicidal ideations, in part because of the poor service in some of the hospitals. And this is actually reflecting the fact that suicide is the second leading cause of death among veterans. So a lot of veterans don't really feel that they can reach out to the VA or other services, or they don't think that the VA will be effective because the wait time is too long in order to get help with their mental health, and therefore they resort to suicide. And of course, tying it back to Gulf War illness. Gulf War illness is only a small part of this equation. There's many other conditions, most notably PTSD, that contributes to this. But Gulf War illness still depletes the emotional well-being of soldiers because it makes it harder for them to reintegrate back to civilian life. It is a mark of war. It is still a very difficult condition to live with. And while there's not really treatments in place for Gulf War illness besides group therapy and besides certain medications such as SSRIs, um, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do more. Because after all, war is not stopping, and there will be more wars, and there are going to be more cases that are similar to Gulf War illness as we're tinkering with more advanced technologies. Then there's only an example of this. Actually, there was recently a piece in the New York Times that was released about a report from the military that detailed problems with in artillery units in Syria during the war against ISIS. It turns out that the units who use artillery much more than the average artillery unit, the soldiers actually experience hallucinations and mental problems due to the shock from the artillery. And again, while this is a much smaller group, it shows how the human body can go traumatic experiences in the war in a war zone. So, in order to ensure that more veterans do not suffer, there can be several steps taken. First, we must create support groups. Once again, I know this is something that I've said in previous videos, but it still applies here. Support groups are crucial to create a sense of community and to create a sense of protecting each other's mental health. Second, there should be a public health campaign to raise awareness about Gulf War illness. Considering the amount of veterans that have served and are currently living in the U.S., and the fact that a lot of people don't really know about this condition, is a problem. So we need to have an awareness campaign to make sure that people understand what this condition entails, to make sure people understand what these veterans have gone through. And there should also be more research that is allocated to looking for treatments. I was conducting research on plants that could reduce inflammation and how they can help symptoms. But again, we need more of these studies, because while my study wasn't necessarily finding the magic treatment, right, there can be improvements made in treating this condition, and right now the treatment is subpar. And fourth, there must be a political campaign in order to advocate for greater VA spending and a budget that encompasses not just physical care but also mental health care. And I was going to get to this earlier on, but again, I don't want to make it seem like the VA is not acting or the VA is a terrible place. Recently, actually, some VA hospitals have performed much better than civilian hospitals. But a lot of large VA hospitals, especially in crowded, dense areas, have a reputation for providing subpar care. And this is something that they have carried on from the days of the Vietnam War. And again, as the tide of soldiers have risen and fallen over the years, the quality of service has changed. But we need to ensure that it's a more stable service over the years. So overall, there should be more support for veterans when it comes to mental health and substance abuse, and the treatment for GWI is not here, but there can be support for veterans in terms of mental health support, so they can at least manage their symptoms and work to reintegrate back into society. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this video, and next time I'll be posting a video about some of the more theoretical aspects of these conditions. But again, please feel free to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.